A P-51 Mustang died at a packed air show. Every certified mechanic spent 40 minutes on the engine and failed to fix it. Then a 12-year-old girl walked up, reached in, moved one wire, and the Mustang roared back to life. 3 seconds. Every mechanic stood there in silence. The Ridgepoint Air Festival happened every year on the second Saturday of September at Ridgepoint Airfield in central Ohio. It was not the largest air show in the country. It was not the most famous. But for the people who drove 2 and 3 hours to get there, most of them from small farming towns scattered across the state, it was the best day of the year. There were food trucks lined up along the south fence and a static display row where vintage aircraft sat in the morning light with their cowlings open and their histories written on small placards that people leaned close to read. Children ran between the displays and pressed their faces against the chain-link fence along the flight line. Old men stood with their arms crossed and their eyes on the sky and their mouths not moving much, the way old men stand at air shows everywhere. The festival had a program. The program had a schedule. And the centerpiece of that schedule, listed in bold on the front page, was the afternoon flight of the Red Falcon. The Red Falcon was a P-51D Mustang. She was painted deep red with a white lightning stripe that ran from the tip of her nose all the way back to the base of her tail. Her owner was a man named Gerald Cobb, 61 years old, a retired contractor from Dayton who had spent 11 years and more money than he ever talked about restoring her from a rusted airframe he had found sitting in a barn in rural Kentucky. The airframe had been in that barn for 30 years. Gerald had driven out to see it on a Tuesday afternoon in October on the word of a friend, and he had stood in the doorway of that barn looking at the wreck of what had once been one of the finest fighter aircraft ever built, and he had written a check before he drove home. Gerald was not a pilot. He had never flown anything. He had hired a retired Air Force captain named Frank Dolan, 54 years old, to fly the Red Falcon at shows. Frank had thousands of hours in his logbook across a dozen different airframes. He was a quiet and unhurried man who did his job without performance. Every time Frank took the Red Falcon up, Gerald stood at the fence line with his hands in his pockets and watched with the look of a man watching his own heart move through the sky. The morning of the festival started the way good mornings do. The sky was clear and blue with just enough high cloud to give it depth. The temperature was in the low 60s and there was a light wind out of the northwest that kept the air sharp and clean. The crowd came in steadily from 8 in the morning, families and couples and groups of men in veteran caps and small children who had been told they were going to see airplanes and did not yet know what that meant. By 9:30 there were close to 3,000 people along the flight line, and the energy of the crowd was the particular energy of people who have come a long way for something specific and believe they are about to get it. Frank Dolan had completed his pre-flight walkthrough by 9 o'clock. He moved from nose to tail in the same order he always used, checking each system the same way he had always checked it. He noted nothing outside of normal parameters. He signed the maintenance sheet at 9:15 and told the ground crew he was ready when they were. The problem started at 9:47. Frank climbed into the cockpit and settled into the seat and ran through the startup sequence the way he had run through it hundreds of times before. The crowd at the fence turned toward the aircraft. The festival announcer, a cheerful and experienced man named Pete who had been doing this job for 12 years, began describing the P-51 Mustang for the audience in the warm and confident voice he used when he had good material to work with. He talked about the Merlin engine. He talked about the long-range escort missions over occupied Europe. He talked about the pilots who flew her and the mechanics who kept her flying. He had a lot of good material and he used it well. The starter motor engaged. The propeller turned through several full blades. The engine caught for less than 1 second and then went silent. Frank waited and tried again. The same result. A brief rough sound of something finding ignition, uneven and incomplete, and then nothing. Pete kept talking. His voice did not change. Gerald Cobb was standing at the fence line 20 feet from the nose of the aircraft. He had been smiling 30 seconds earlier. The smile was gone now and in its place was the still expression of a man who is watching something go wrong and has not yet decided how wrong it is going to get. Frank climbed out of the cockpit and the ground crew moved in. Their names were Dave Marsden, Kevin Tully, and Sal Greco. Dave was the lead. He had 9 years of warbird maintenance behind him, 4 of them with the Midwest Warbird Foundation and 5 before that at a private restoration shop in Indiana. Kevin had 6 years. Sal had 4. All 3 held airframe and powerplant licenses. All 3 had worked on the Red Falcon at previous shows. Dave was a methodical man who did not make guesses and did not skip steps. He pulled out his checklist and started from the top without being asked. They checked the fuel system. The fuel selector was on the correct tank. The fuel pressure was within range. No contamination in the gascolator. They checked the ignition leads on both sides of the engine for visible damage or loose connections. Nothing wrong. They checked the primer line for blockage. Clear. They attempted a start at 10:04. The engine caught and died within 2 seconds. Dave crouched at the lower cowling and went back through his notes. Kevin pulled the inspection panel on the right side and checked the spark plug leads on the forward cylinders. Sal went back to the fuel system and checked it again from a different angle. Dave then pulled both magnetos with the portable checker he kept in the tool cart. Both tested within acceptable range on the ground. He re-gapped 3 spark plugs on the left bank that were slightly outside specification, working with the focused economy of a man who has done this particular task many times and does it correctly every time. They attempted a start at 10:19. The engine caught, ran rough and uneven for 2 full seconds, and then stopped. The crowd had been patient. 3,000 people had driven a long way and paid for a festival program and found good spots along the fence line, and they were not going to give that up without a reason. But patience at an air show is a specific kind of patience. It exists in proportion to the sense that something is happening. When the something stops happening, the patience starts to become something else. People near the food trucks began to drift back toward the concession tents. A family near the center of the fence line, parents and 3 children, picked up their folding chairs and moved toward the static display row. A group of teenagers near the far end of the fence gave up entirely and walked away with their hands in their pockets. Pete kept talking. He had moved on to a segment about the Tuskegee Airmen, which was genuinely interesting material, and he delivered it with the warmth of someone who meant it. But the crowd could see the Red Falcon sitting cold on the apron and they understood that something was not going as planned. Gerald Cobb walked from the fence line to the edge of the work area and stood with his hands in his pockets. He did not say anything to Dave. He did not interfere with the crew. He stood there the way owners stand when the thing they have built is not doing what it is supposed to do, present and watchful and containing whatever he was feeling in a space that did not reach his face. Dave looked up at him once and nodded. Gerald nodded back. Dave went back to work. The 4th attempt came at 10:31. The 5th at 10:44. The 6th at 10:52. Each time the sequence was the same. The starter motor engaged, the propeller turned, the engine found something briefly and lost it before it could build to a stable idle. Each time Dave stood up from whatever component he had just inspected and looked at the aircraft with the expression of a man who knows the answer is somewhere close and is becoming less certain where close means. By 11 o'clock, the event director Carol Hines had come down from the operations tent at the north end of the field. She was a competent woman who had run this festival for 7 years and had managed problems in public long enough to do it without showing the problem on her face. She stood near Gerald and watched Dave and his crew work without rushing them. But every few minutes she looked at the crowd along the fence line, and each time she looked there were fewer people there than the time before. At a picnic table 40 feet back from the static display area, a girl named Maggie Voss was eating a corn dog and reading a book. She was 12 years old. She had straight brown hair pulled into a ponytail and she was wearing a gray hoodie with the name of her middle school printed on the chest. She had come to the festival with her father Tom, who was somewhere near the fence line in conversation with a man he had recognized from his church. Tom had told Maggie he would be back in 10 minutes. That had been 40 minutes ago. Maggie was not bothered. She had her book, which was good, and her corn dog, which was also good, and the picnic table was in the sun and out of the wind and she was comfortable. But she had been listening. She had been listening to the Red Falcon's failed start attempts for over an hour. Not because she was trying to listen. She was trying to read her book and she had made reasonable progress. But the sound of the starter motor and the engine's repeated failure to sustain was there in the background, unavoidable and familiar, and she had grown up with sounds like that. Her father Tom Voss was an electrician by trade. He rewired houses and commercial buildings and he was good at his job and he made a decent living at it. But what he loved, the thing he drove 40 minutes each way to the small county airfield in Millfield every clear weekend to be near, was his 1943 Stearman biplane. He had owned it for 14 years. He maintained it himself. He did most of the work in the garage behind their house, and Maggie had been in that garage watching him work since she was old enough to carry a tool without dropping it. Tom Voss was the kind of father who answered questions completely. When Maggie asked him why something worked the way it did, he explained it the way it actually worked, not a simplified version of it. He used the correct terms. He showed her the actual components. He trusted her to follow the explanation and she always did. By the time she was 8 years old she could name every major system on the Stearman from memory. By the time she was 10 she understood how the dual magneto ignition system worked well enough to explain it to someone else. By the time she was 11 she had helped her father replace a cracked P-lead boot on the Stearman, holding the work light steady with one hand while Tom made the connection with the other, and Tom had talked her through every step of the repair as he did it so that she would understand not just what he was doing but why. She had been listening to the Red Falcon's failed starts for an hour and 10 minutes. After the sixth failed attempt, sitting at the picnic table with her corn dog and her book, she understood what she was hearing. She set the corn dog down on the napkin. If you have ever stood near a vintage Merlin engine when it finally lights and that sound rolls out across a field and into your chest, hit the like button right now and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if you have a veteran or an aviation person in your life, tag them right now. I read every single comment. Maggie walked from the picnic table to the edge of the ground crew work area. There were orange cones marking the spectator boundary. She stopped at the cones. Dave was crouched at the lower left side of the cowling with a flashlight directed at the ignition components. Kevin was at the right side checking the spark plug lead connections on the aft cylinders. Sal was going over the primer line connection at the firewall for the third time. Maggie looked at the right side of the engine. From where she stood she could see the routing of the P-lead wire from the right magneto toward the cockpit firewall. The wire passed close to the steel engine mount bracket. At this distance she could not see the condition of the insulation boot clearly, but she had been listening to the start attempts for long enough to know where the problem was. She said, in a normal and even voice, the way she would say something across the kitchen table, "Excuse me. Your right P-lead boot is cracked. The wire is grounding against the mount bracket every time the engine starts to vibrate." Nobody responded. Dave did not look up from the cowling. Kevin did not turn around from the plug leads. Sal kept his eyes on the primer line. The three of them were deep in the specific concentration of people who are working a problem under pressure and have closed the edges of their attention to everything outside the aircraft. Maggie stood at the cones for a moment. Then she walked back to her picnic table and picked up her corn dog. She sat there. She read one page of her book. She heard the crew attempt another start. The engine caught and died the same way it had caught and died 6 times before. She heard Dave call out to Kevin. She heard Kevin respond. She heard the sound of tools on metal. She set her book down. She got up from the picnic table. This time she did not stop at the orange cones. She stepped over them and walked directly to the right side of the engine. Nobody stopped her. Nobody was watching the cones. Every mechanic had his full attention somewhere else on the aircraft, and a quiet 12-year-old girl in a gray hoodie did not register at the edge of anyone's vision as something that required a response. Maggie crouched at the lower right corner of the firewall. The P-lead wire ran from the back of the right magneto up toward the cockpit firewall, and where it passed closest to the steel engine mount bracket, the rubber insulation boot that protected the wire had a split in it. The crack ran about 1.5 inches along the length of the boot. It was not a dramatic crack. It was the kind of small fault that a person could look at directly and not register if they were looking for something else, if their mental picture of what the problem looked like was bigger than what was actually there. When the engine vibrated on start, the bare copper wire inside the split boot flexed against the steel bracket and completed a ground circuit. The right magneto went dead. Every single time. Without variation and without fail. Maggie had a hair tie on her wrist. She slid it off. She pressed the cracked section of boot firmly away from the bracket surface and looped the hair tie twice around the wire routing, securing the boot against itself and holding the wire clear of the steel with 1/4 inch of open space between them. The ground path was broken. The wire could no longer make contact with the bracket under vibration. She stood up and stepped back. The whole thing took 3 seconds. She walked around the nose of the aircraft to where Frank Dolan was standing with his arms crossed, watching his ground crew work with the patient stillness of a man who has learned that watching quietly is better than saying things that do not help. Maggie stopped in front of him and said, "You can try it now." The right P-lead boot had a crack in it and the wire was grounding against the mount bracket on every start attempt. I moved the wire clear of the bracket and tied it off. It will hold long enough to start and run today, but you will need a proper replacement boot before the next flight. Frank Dolan looked at her. He looked at the orange cones she had clearly come from beyond. He looked back at her face. He said, "How old are you?" Maggie said, 12. Frank held her gaze for one more second. He was a man who had spent 30 years trusting instruments and the people who maintained them, and he had developed over those years a sense for when someone was telling him a true thing. He turned without another word and climbed back into the cockpit. Dave Marsden had heard the exchange. He walked around to the right side of the firewall and crouched where Maggie had been crouching 30 seconds earlier. He saw the hair tie looped around the P-lead boot routing. He saw the split in the rubber. He saw the 1/4 inch of clearance between the wire and the bracket. He stayed crouched there without moving for a moment that was longer than it needed to be for him to understand what he was looking at. Kevin came around the nose and looked over Dave's shoulder. Dave said, quietly, "That's it." Kevin did not say anything. Carol Hines had watched all of it from 20 feet away. She had watched Maggie step over the cones. She had watched her crouch at the firewall. She had watched the 3 seconds of work and the conversation with Frank and Frank climbing back into the cockpit. She stood very still with her clipboard at her side. In the cockpit, Frank Dolan ran the startup sequence. The Merlin engine caught on the first attempt. It came up clean and even, both magnetos contributing through all 12 cylinders, building from the rough first catch to a smooth and rising idle in the space of a few seconds, and the sound that came off the Red Falcon as she sat on the apron and ran up to temperature was not a sound that had any business being in the 21st century. It was older than that. It was a sound that belonged to a different era, a time when the machines people built were loud and physical and present in a way that left no room for doubt about what they were doing. It went through the concrete of the apron and up through the steel of the chain-link fence and into the chests of every person still standing near the flight line, and it reached past the flight line to the food trucks and the static display row and the families who had drifted away and pulled them all back toward the fence the way a large and sudden thing pulls people toward it without asking. The crowd returned in under 2 minutes. A boy who had been sitting on the grass facing away from the flight line stood up and turned around so fast he stumbled, then grabbed the fence with both hands and stared at the aircraft with his mouth open. An older man in a Vietnam veteran cap who had been at the fence line all morning and had not moved through any of the failed attempts put both hands over the top rail and leaned forward and closed his eyes for a moment. Gerald Cobb, standing at the outer edge of the apron, put both hands over his face. He held them there. Then he took them down and looked at his aircraft and had the expression of a man who has just been given back something he was afraid he had lost for good. "Stay with us." We are not finished yet. Dave Marsden came to Maggie's picnic table at 11:42. He walked across the apron at a steady and deliberate pace and he sat down across from her without being invited and without apologizing for not being invited. He had washed his hands. He set his clipboard on the table face down. He said, "My name is Dave Marsden. I am the lead mechanic on that aircraft. I have 9 years on Warbirds and I have been the primary mechanic on the Red Falcon for 3 of those years. I want you to understand that before I say what I am going to say." Maggie looked at him and waited. He said, "You told us the answer the first time you walked up to those cones." I did not look up. I did not respond. None of us did. We went on working for another 45 minutes on an aircraft you had already diagnosed. That was wrong, and I am sorry for it. Maggie said, "You didn't know who I was. I was standing outside the boundary cones." Dave said, "That is true. But you used the right words. You said P-lead. You said grounding. You said mount bracket. Those 3 words together are specific. A person who says those 3 words together knows what they are talking about. I should have stopped and looked at you when you said them. I did not, and we lost 45 minutes because of it." Maggie thought about that for a moment. She said, "My dad says you can always tell the difference between someone who knows something and someone who is guessing by whether they can name the specific part. General words mean guessing. Specific words mean knowledge." Dave said, "Your dad is right." He paused. He said, "How did you know it was the right magneto and not the left?" Maggie said, "The way the catch sounded. When the left magneto is the problem, the catch is weaker and wider, like it is spread across more cylinders failing together. This catch was sharp and short, one side collapsing fast. The right magneto bracket sits closer to the P-lead routing on this engine mount configuration, which makes the right side more likely to ground out first when the boot starts to crack. My dad explained the difference when we did the same repair on our Stearman last spring." Dave looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You just explained that better than most people with an airframe and powerplant license would explain it." Maggie said, "I just repeated what my dad told me." Dave said, "Then your dad explained it very well." Tom Voss arrived at the picnic table 12 minutes later, walking with the slightly guilty pace of a father who has been absent longer than he said he would be. He was a tall man with the same straight brown hair as his daughter and the look of someone who has already guessed that he missed something. He found Maggie at the table with a mechanic he did not recognize sitting across from her, and both of them in what appeared to be a serious conversation. He looked at Maggie first. She was fine. Then he looked at Dave. Dave stood up and introduced himself and laid out the full sequence of events in plain and direct language, starting with the first failed attempt at 9:47 and ending with the hair tie on the P-lead boot and the engine starting on the first attempt after. Tom listened to the whole thing without speaking. When Dave finished, Tom turned and looked at his daughter. Maggie was looking at her book. Tom said, "Mags." She looked up. He said, "You stepped over the cones." She said, "Nobody was listening." Tom looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down next to her and put his arm around her shoulder and she let him, which meant she was not bothered by the attention at the moment, which told him something about how she was feeling. He said to Dave, "She helped me with the same repair on our Stearman last spring. I did not know she had absorbed enough of it to recognize the fault by sound in a different aircraft." Dave said, "She absorbed all of it. And then some." Tom looked at his daughter the way a parent looks at a child when something they have always half known about them becomes fully and undeniably clear. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. Recognition. Gerald Cobb found them at the table 20 minutes after that. He had heard the full account from Carol Hines, and he had watched the Red Falcon taxi out and hold at the runway threshold, and he had watched Frank push the throttle forward, and he had watched her run down the runway and lift into the September sky, and then he had gone looking for the girl in the gray hoodie. He sat down at the picnic table without ceremony. He was not a man who prepared speeches. He looked at Maggie and said, "I understand you fixed my aircraft." Maggie said, "I moved a wire. The mechanic still needs to replace the boot properly before the next flight." Gerald said, "That aircraft has been in my life for 11 years. I pulled her out of a barn and I put her back together piece by piece. 3,000 people came here today to watch her fly. She was not going to fly today without what you did." He stopped for a moment. "I want you to know that I understand that completely." Maggie said, "Okay." Gerald smiled at that answer. He reached into the chest pocket of his jacket and brought out a small pin. It was a red enamel P-51 Mustang silhouette mounted on a silver backing, a collector's pin the size of a thumbnail. He set it on the table in front of her. He said, "That pin has been on my jacket since the first day she flew. I want you to have it." Maggie picked it up and turned it over in her hand and looked at the detail on the back. She said, "Thank you." Gerald said, "Come back next year. I will have Frank take you up in the back seat if your father says yes." Tom said yes before Gerald had fully finished the sentence. The Red Falcon made 4 passes over Ridgepoint Airfield that afternoon. The first was low and straight at 200 feet above the runway, and the sound she made at that altitude was the kind of sound that people felt in their back teeth and remembered for years. The second was a climbing roll to the right that took her up into the blue and held every face in the field turned skyward until she was a small red shape against the high clouds. The third was a slow gear down pass, the kind that is about looking at a thing clearly rather than watching it go fast. The fourth was a high pass at pattern altitude, quieter than the others, the kind of final pass that tells a crowd the day is ending. That fourth pass landed differently than the others. It was the one people drove home thinking about. Maggie watched all 4 from the picnic table. She had finished her corn dog and her book by the second pass. For the last 2 passes she sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her and watched the sky. The red enamel pin was in the front pocket of her hoodie. Tom drove them home to Millfield on Route 33, the way they always went, past the grain elevators and the farm supply store and the old drive-in theater that had been closed for longer than Maggie had been alive. The afternoon light was going gold across the flat Ohio fields, the long September light that made everything look settled and certain. After a while Tom said, "You should have told me you understood the magneto system that well." Maggie said, "I didn't know I did. Not until today." Tom said, "When we did that repair last spring I wasn't sure how much you were actually taking in." Maggie said, "I take in everything. I just don't always say so." Tom was quiet for 2 miles of straight road. Then he said, "I am going to start explaining more things." Maggie said, "Good." They drove the rest of the way without talking, which was comfortable the way silences are comfortable between people who do not need to fill them. When they got home Maggie went straight to the garage. The steerman sat under the fluorescent strip light on the left side of the garage with the engine cowling open the way Tom left it between working sessions. The tools hung on the pegboard wall in the order Tom always kept them, organized by function and by size, the way his own father had taught him to keep them. Maggie stood at the workbench for a moment. She took the red enamel pin out of her hoodie pocket and set it on the corner of the bench under the light where she could see it clearly. She looked at it for a while. It was a small thing. A red P-51 silhouette on silver backing, smaller than her thumb. But it had been on a man's jacket since the first day his aircraft flew. 11 years. That was not a small thing at all. She pulled the stool over and sat down in front of the steerman's open engine bay. She did not start working right away. She sat and looked at the engine the way she had been looking at it for years but with something different behind her eyes now, a kind of seeing that felt more like knowing. The familiar layout of components. The logical sequence of each system. The way everything connected to everything else in an order that made complete sense once you understood the reason each piece was there. She thought about the sound the Red Falcon had made when she finally caught on that first attempt after the repair. The way it had changed the entire field in a single moment. The way 3,000 people had turned back toward the fence without anyone asking them to. She thought about Dave Marsden sitting across from her at the picnic table and saying the words "I am sorry for it" without adding any explanation that would make the apology smaller. She thought about how that was the right way to say a thing like that and how she would remember it. She thought about Gerald Cobb's hands over his face at the moment the engine started. Tom came into the garage 20 minutes later carrying 2 glasses of water. He set one on the bench beside her without saying anything. He looked at what she was doing. She had the work light in her left hand and she was tracing the routing of the ignition harness with the beam, following each lead slowly from the magneto to the spark plug with her eyes and the light, not touching anything, only learning the path. Tom sat on the other stool and watched her for a moment. He said, "I want to show you the full ignition system tonight. All of it, from the magneto forward. Every connection point and every reason for it." Maggie lowered the light and looked at him. He said, "You already know most of it. But I want to make sure you know all of it." Maggie said, "Okay." Tom reached across and picked up the old parts envelope from the corner of the bench. He turned it to the blank side and pulled the pencil from the shelf above the pegboard. He started drawing. He drew the magneto and the P lead and the connection at the firewall. He drew the routing from each magneto to the ignition switch and from the switch forward to each spark plug on each cylinder bank. He drew the ground paths. He labeled every component with its correct name and he explained every label as he wrote it, completely and without shortcuts, the way he had always explained things to her. Maggie watched every line appear on the envelope. She asked 7 questions. He answered all 7 completely. When he finished the diagram she took the pencil from his hand and drew one more connection he had not drawn yet. She drew the ground path through the engine mount bracket, the path that became a fault when the insulation boot cracked and the bare wire made contact with the steel, the exact failure mode that had grounded the Red Falcon's right magneto and kept her silent on the apron for 45 minutes in front of 3,000 people. Tom looked at what she had added to his diagram. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's exactly right." Maggie set the pencil down on the bench. She picked up the work light again and turned back to the steerman. They stayed in the garage for another hour, father and daughter, with the Ohio evening coming in through the open side door and the light outside going from gold to gray to dark. Tom explained and Maggie listened and asked questions and Tom answered them, and the steerman sat between them the way it always had, patient and familiar and waiting to be fully understood. When they finally went inside, Maggie left the red enamel pin on the corner of the workbench. Not because she forgot it. Because that was exactly where it belonged. Thank you for staying until the last word. If this story moved you, the next one is already on your screen right now. Go give it a watch. And if you have not subscribed yet, join us. We tell these stories so the people who live them are never forgotten.